The idea of the zombie, for instance, originates within Haitian Vodou, within Haitian culture, and gets perverted into the American media sphere. And now this becomes the stuff of nightmares.
Welcome to today's episode of The Culture Gap from New York with Dr. Auguste. He's a forensic psychologist exploring Black liberation psychology and Haitian mental health.
How does a group of people who've experienced centuries of enslavement, how do they understand pain?
We're not talking just about history in this episode. We're talking about how this history connects to mental health care today and the system that Black Americans live in.
By psychiatrists who only a few hours before it told me we give everybody the same diagnosis because it makes our paperwork easier.
This episode is out now. Watch and listen wherever you get your podcasts and let us know your thoughts. Let's get into it. Hi, Evan. Thank you so much for joining today and rushing through traffic to meet us. We're here today to talk about your work that you do in New York, talk a little bit about Haiti, and to talk about liberation psychology.
Yes.
So thank you for joining. To start off with, I think it would be helpful for the viewers and for me to know a little bit about you. So can you tell us who you are, a bit about where you grew up, your background?
Yeah, I love that. That's a more comprehensive intro than people usually ask. So my name is Evan Auguste.
Okay.
I grew up on Great Neck, Long Island, and so people out there call me Evan Auguste, just the same name, a little bit of the American accent to it. And I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist. I focus on the psychological impacts of structural anti-Blackness. It's a lot of terms, concepts people might not understand immediately, but I'm sure through our conversation, people will understand what that work looks like. And so I look at incarceration, looking at Black youth in the U.S., and I look at colonial violence in Haiti. So both looking at the psychological impacts of that and how can we in community devise these solutions that we need to build psychological resilience and community political power, I would say. Yeah.
And you mentioned Haiti, and I know that you have a Haitian background too.
Yes.
So tell me about that. What was it like growing up with that? And you know, when you look back now at the academic work you're doing compared to your memories of your childhood, what are you gleaning from it?
Oh, this is beautiful. I already love these questions because they're threading the personal with the work. So I'm Haitian on my father's side. My father grew up in Haiti. My mother is African-American. She's always sure that I make sure people understand I have both lineages within me, and they're very central. So where I grew up on Long Island, a lot of people did not understand the history of Haiti. In the U.S., being Haitian historically, I would say for the last 200 years, has carried quite a big stigma. But for whatever reason, where I grew up, people were not familiar with that history. And so it kind of felt like holding a culture that was invisibilized in the community I was growing up in. People didn't understand the language, the food, any of the political context that shaped the day-to-day life. I would say honestly until the 2010 earthquake, right, where the Haiti, the impacts was national news. And then even then, what grabbed headlines was Haiti as the poorest country in the hemisphere. And so it masked a lot of cultural, historic, political brilliance that as I began to learn more and more about my culture, I began to fall increasingly in love with it. So looking at threading psychology in this, right? As I was learning psychology, I saw how many different philosophies, religious systems, spiritual systems were central to different practices of psychology. Right? You start talking about third wave CBT, a lot of people lean into aspects of Buddhism when it comes to that work. Right. Exactly. I believe Marsha Linehan, who does dialectical behavioral therapy, says she was divinely inspired to what I assume was through some Abrahamic tradition to create that particular modality. And I always thought it was fascinating that in all these conversations about psychology, the wisdom of Haitian people specifically, but Black and African people broadly, were not leveraged, or at the very least, I was not taught about how they were leveraged. And so I was kind of curious about is how are these people understanding mental health? How are these people understanding health? Because if all these other groups of people in the world have brilliance that can help heal people, my people must be able to do the same thing. That's the kind of curiosity I was initially motivated by.
And actually, you then made me curious about this person called Louis Mars, because when we first met, you told me about him, and I went and read about it. And it's so interesting because I think even the concept of, ethnopsychiatry and understanding, but for the listeners, tell us a little bit about Louis Mars, because I feel like you'd give a better definition than me.
Of course. Yeah. So some of the background, right, is I have a frustration and I have some background history. My frustration is, again, to the point about how I meet Louis Mars as a historical figure. I'd been at that point to a number of medical missions, volunteering in Haiti, doing a lot of mental health work, kind of supporting psychiatrists there. I was still building my Haitian Creole language skills. It's still not great. So if you're watching this, don't ask me to speak. But maybe by the time this episode's out, actually, maybe I'll be a little bit better. And the one narrative that kind of followed me around was, Haitian people, we don't care about mental health. We don't have psychology. We don't have psychiatry. There's this deep stigma around it. And I was in my global mental health class in my doctoral program, and one of my professors, shout out Professor Andrew Rasmussen, said, Evan, I hear the question you're asking. You might be interested in this man named Louis Mars. He coined what's called ethnopsychiatry. And so I'm a nerd, right? So as soon as somebody sets me down the path, I'm obsessive. I'm going to find every single thing that I can. And so I was combing through every book, every article. I reached out to Deborah Jensen at the point. She's a professor over at Duke, had done a lot of archival work, and was able to thread all of these distinct histories. And so to answer your question, who was he? He's Haiti's first psychiatrist, right? So right after the occupation, the U.S. occupied Haiti through the early 1900s, the country was reeling from that type of state-based and colonial violence. Right? At the time, anybody who experienced distress were thrown into Marine barracks, right, and held far away from the cities. And Louis Mars kind of emerges in this context, looking at the way that people who are in distress are treated in his home country, and he seeks to rewrite the entire practice then of psychiatry. What people might not know is at the time, a lot of the prevailing theories were that African descendant peoples and African peoples did not have a mature or developed enough mind to experience the array of psychological disorders that were being kind of categorized and conceptualized within Europe and the US. Right? The idea was that this was an adolescent mind. And so Louis Mars comes along, and through his practice, he says, no, what we're seeing is an entire new way of understanding the mind, one that needs us to value and deeply understand, deeply theorize the collective self, the spiritual self, right? The historical self. How does a group of people who've experienced centuries of enslavement, how do they understand pain? How do they build a culture?
And you speak about some of his work he's done with Vodou.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about that, because I think for people like me who's outside of the community, the understanding I had of Vodou before reading his work was very kind of just sensationalized and, a fictionalized version of it almost. Because we don't really have a huge enough Haitian community in London or in England for me to really tap into it and, go to my friends and ask, what's that like? So can you tell us a bit about that and how we kind of help to depathologize it?
Of course. So I would thread this in two ways, because even me having this conversation with you, I'm sure there are Caribbean, African descendant people who hear Vodou and they have a much deeper stigma even though the wider world does. Why is this psychologist going on talking about this piece that we're trying to distance ourselves from? Right? That is the aspects of our culture that we're the most either ashamed of or want to move away from for advancement. And so Vodou is a spiritual practice. It's a religious tradition. Some people would say it's a philosophical framework that was braided together through a lot of the early enslaved African peoples on the island of Haiti. Right? You had people from all throughout the continent, predominantly West Africa, some Central Africa, come together, and as opposed to battling, right, for whose spiritual system was the most superior, you saw this threading together of all these distinct traditions to, in many ways, create a people. Right. And so what people might not know is the Haitian Revolution, in which they defeated the French army. It began in a Vodou ceremony at Bois Caïma. right? In which people came together. It was led by Boukman Dati, who was an enslaved African person initially on Jamaica, who made his way to Haiti, and Cecile Fatima. They led all the enslaved peoples there, right, to engage in this ceremony, and it led to the revolution that Haiti eventually was victorious in. And so within Vodou, then, you have an entire matrix of understanding the world, the spirit. Many people, again, don't see the same types of divisions between spiritual systems. They have no issue both understanding themselves as Catholic or Christian as well as practicing Vodou practices, right? So that's what Vodou is. It's a way of understanding other people collectively, spirits collectively, nature, right? Life and the afterlife. It's an entire way of understanding this, much in the same way you might look at, again, a Buddhism, for instance.
So because I find it interesting that it's become so stigmatized within the kind of African and Caribbean communities, because I think it's very much, a lot of our understanding is that, the white imperialist lens of it and stigmatizing it. But actually there's something there within our people that it's causing this divide, right? Yeah,
and so it's not by accident. So Wade Nobles, Jean Casimir, Baina Bello have done a lot of good work on the kind of the ramifications of colonial violence on Haitian people. And so when Haitian people first achieved liberation, some of the issue is you had a lot of the leaders who were socialized and developed within the context of enslavement. Right. And so you almost had this rival mentality between what was called the indigenous army of African people, who looked at their practices, who looked at their politics and sought to build a foundation of that. And you had some of the African people who, again, were socialized within enslavement and looked at the French Republic as the model of civility. And so because of this, there was a lot of internalized stigma of these particular practices. So even post-liberation, you get the stamping out of people engaged in Vodou. And this just continues, right? You have superstition campaigns led by the Vatican in which practitioners are vanquished, or materials are burned, destroyed. During the U.S. occupation that I had mentioned, at a certain point after engaged in brutal fights with the resistance army in Haiti, the U.S. Marines began to just shoot through drums, shoot through any cultural artifact that they could find that represented Vodou, because for them, Vodou became synonymous with Haitian resistance. And so this has kind of continued. During that period of time, you get a lot of the superstitions that people might be more familiar with begin to creep into American media. So the idea of the zombie, for instance, originates within Haitian Vodou, within Haitian culture, and gets perverted, stretched into the American media sphere. And now this becomes the stuff of nightmares, right? So all these different tales and myths and ideas from Vodou become what a lot of American people use to anchor their nightmares.
And it's interesting because when I grew up in India, there's a lot of indigenous beliefs there that I grew up with. And, we would go to certain temples or holy places where humans would kind of, the belief is that they become possessed by gods or goddesses, and then you pray to them and they, grant you a wish or and something of those thought. And I can sense that I've definitely distanced myself from that part of, my mind or memories when I'm in England, when I'm in London. Because I think that there's a mentality of, if it's so out of someone else's reality, why bother trying to connect them to it? I don't know if that kind of resonates, but I've just never really talked about it to people outside of my community, because I think it's just something that other people understandably would find so bizarre that the only way they would then judge it is negatively.
Yes. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say outside of someone's reality? I'm curious about that.
I think for some people, because when we talk about, in psychiatry, we talk about kind of cultural and religious norms.
Sure.
I can definitely understand that those kind of beliefs are so outside of, some of my friends' cultural norms that it's not their reality, right? And they might argue that it's not real, that someone's being possessed by a goddess. That doesn't make sense, that's real. But there's huge communities in India that do believe that, and they live very functional lives believing that. They're not mentally ill because of it. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
I love it. Okay, so this is beautiful. I'm thinking 3 things.
That's so specific. 3
yeah,
things.
it helps me organize my thoughts. My students are sick of it. And so the first piece comes from Sylvia Wynter, who talks about human beings being sociogenic.
Okay.
Right? A lot of the ways that we develop, more so than being predetermined by a particular genetic code, are intensely and deeply shaped by our social and cultural world in a way that's like very material, in a way that kind of punctures through what we often debate about in psychiatry and psychology, that nature-nurture debate, as those two being deeply, inextricably threaded together. Right? And so you cannot understand a person, you cannot understand a people without understanding the overarching, again, history, culture, society in which they're in. So that's the first piece, right? And so to your point, somebody who's raised in particular society and culture in which this is not real, right? They don't experience their body in the same way. They don't experience their aspirations and dreams in the same way. They don't experience then their distress in the same way. So of course, right, somebody who's socialized in, like you're mentioning, like in a London, way they experience their body might be radically different than the way some of the indigenous people in India that you're discussing might experience it, is the first piece. The second piece I'm thinking about, I believe it was the Field Sisters have a really good book called Racecraft.
Okay.
And so they talk about how in the same way that a lot of different groups had superstitions that organized their world, right? These weren't just myths that people had an opinion about. They were seen as material ways in which politics and society need to be understood, right? We had Salem witch trials in the United States, right? Marie Laveau in New Orleans was a material force in shaping some of the policy around her. And again, these are rooted in belief systems that a lot of people would say, oh, we don't think that's real. We don't think that's true. What they make the comparison is that's much the same way we understand, like, race, right? Race, even though we can all understand this as a social construction, nonetheless has a material impact on the way people not just think about other people, but the way that people develop, because it structures the entire world around them. Right? And so what do we then think about these models of people who understand themselves to be capable of becoming possessed, right? Well, they're organized and they're growing within a world. There might be more distinct types of social phenomena that become more susceptible or sensitive to in ways that we don't experience our minds and our bodies, right? The third piece is you can look then through a lot of the writings of Louis Mars in Haiti. Frantz Fanon wrote about this in Algeria, where he found a lot of cultures that had these ideas about possession, in some ways ended up having a bit less individual stigma for the person who was experiencing distress and pain, because the idea was this is not their fault, right? This is somebody who needs to be embraced and held more deeply.
So the locus of the illness goes from within you as an individual to the community.
Exactly. And Frantz Fanon, again, he was curious about that because at the time he was an atheist. Frantz Fanon was a studied Marxist, and so did not deeply believe in any of these traditions, but witnessed the way that society shifted around them. And so he pondered, like, what is right? What is better? Right? To have one in which I saw a little bit of the intro you're talking about, right? Some of the conditions in the United States, where you can walk through New York, and people will individualize and blame that person for the distress that they're experiencing, right? Independent of whether or not their experience of treatment is painful, is difficult, is effective, not effective. Again, the blame is housed within that individual's bodies, and we see how these people get treated both in the streets of New York and in some of the state hospitals where they end up, and it's not positive at all, right? So I guess what I would say is, like, a lot of these frameworks people might see as, again, a bit more folk, maybe less civilized, but with all frameworks, right, there's benefits, there's distinctions in how people are treated, and so I think there's lessons to be learned from all of them.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I think, like you said, I think Frantz Fanon was curious about it, but in a very balanced and nuanced way, because from some of his writings you can see that he was also critiquing some of the, the approaches that we have in our countries back home,
yes.
where a community sense is so important, but the danger of it is a community can completely ostracize you.
Yes.
And it can take the agency away from you if they label you as someone who's mentally ill and, doesn't have capacity to do anything for yourself, which I think is a good thing to have in mind when we think about the balance of, how much is it individual agency and how much is it a role and responsibility of us as a community to support people. But that brings me on to your work at your university, where you teach, and the liberation psychology work that you were talking about before. It's not really a concept that's really taught in mainstream psychiatry for us in training. It's something that you do have to go looking for. There's loads of talks about it, but for people who are listening who might not fully kind of understand what we mean by liberation psychology, can you give us like a sentence to describe it?
I cannot give you a sentence. I'm very long-winded, unfortunately.
A very long sentence.
Yeah. Well, so I want to name two pieces, one of which threads something that you had named previously. So liberation psychology, a lot of people anchor that within the work of Ignacio Martin Baró. I practice Black liberation psychology, which is a specific, some people would just name it Black psychology. I like to anchor it with Black liberation psychology. And the way that I might frame it is through Amos Wilson. Right? So Amos Wilson is a Black liberation psychologist, did a lot of work in New York before passing away. And he said, when we look at Black and African cultures, the true critical thinker is able to move through those cultures and see what is useful, what is liberatory for a people, and how do I innovate upon that. Right? And so in the way that we're talking about Fanon, maybe Mars's approach of being balanced, you naming, okay, there's this useful piece here, and we can see the stigma here. Amos Wilson would understand culture as a living thing. Right, that we can innovate and improve upon.
What I find so interesting is that you work in forensics.
Yes.
And the intersection of that with Black liberation psychology is undeniable.
Yeah.
Right? Because even in the UK, we have a big movement towards reforming the Mental Health Act because they've identified that there's a disproportionate number of Black male patients that are being detained forcefully. What's the landscape like in New York? What's going on here in terms of that?
Yeah, it's very bad. It's very, very bad. I spent some time during my training at a forensic state hospital. It's one of these pieces where we discuss all the time people who are marginalized, people who are made vulnerable. And it wasn't until I spent time in the hospital that I began to feel what that meant.
Right.
To watch a, Black man come through who has needed treatment, has been denied treatment because of a lack of insurance, because of being unhoused, nonetheless knowing what their diagnosis is because of previous contact with the system, and to be essentially gaslit by psychiatrists who only a few hours before had told me we give everybody the same diagnosis because it makes our paperwork easier. Right.
That's not a reflection of all psychiatrists, guys.
Yeah. No, it is not. It's not. But I think the piece here is the lack of structural oversight.
I see.
Right.
Okay.
And so I'm like, I try to be very clear and very specific when I make particular criticisms. It's that there are people who are able to operate like this and erase hundreds of people's experiences and desires for care and desires for hope, desires for the future. I had a psychiatrist tell me, there was one particular, I remember this, Black man who wanted to take his case to trial. People might know that to proceed, you need to successfully pass essentially a competency assessment, right? That you can aid yourself and aid your attorney in the courtroom. And this psychiatrist decided, because he looked at the case and didn't think it was worth going to court, that as long as this individual wanted to take his case to court, he was incompetent. Right. Okay. And so you see this systematic and consistent reduction and removal of people's agency as a matter of practice, right? And so because of this, there are a lot of, I believe it's the WHO had named that in a lot of these state hospitals, you see routine human rights abuses. That's not just abroad, that's in the United States as well. And so to your point, I want to name this, right? That's not all to hospitals.
Yeah.
But it's enough of them that it's worth people organizing and understanding and fully seeing the types of people who have these experiences. And I would say right now in our public conversation, these people are frequently ostracized and moved to the margins of our conversations about where we want to go politically.
Yeah. Because when you talk about it, it all feels very hopeless, right? It feels like you're stuck in a system that's too institutionalized to change. How do you teach students in a way to mobilize them?
Yeah, it's two pieces. One, people to be mobilized need to understand what they're mobilizing against. I think absent an appropriate analysis of the types of systems that you're talking about, you can make poor strategic decisions that end up not serving any good. And I believe it's Orasami Burton's book, Tip of the Spear. He discusses some of the innovations that Kenneth Clark, who is the first Black president of the American Psychological Association, he is famous. He and Mamie Clark are famous for the Doll study and Brown v. Board of Education. And so he went on to make quite a bit of policy reform in his role. And the downstream effects of some of those policy reforms ended up being devastating for some of the incarcerated Black people in New York. A lot of the reforms ended up leading to difficulties in radical and political education for some incarcerated people. And so people need to understand what are the structures, what are the systems, how is oppression mobilizing and harming people in order to figure out what do I want to reform, what do I want to resist, what do I want to abolish, right? I think this needs to be rooted in a particular analysis, an evidence-based analysis. And so that's what I'll do. I'll name all these different histories for people. I don't think it serves anyone to not understand the urgency with which we're engaging in the field, to not understand the power over people's lives that we have.
And I think the fact that you're so well versed in Haitian history is so important for that, because I think people often forget that that was one of the most early forms of mobilizations we saw that was successful.
Exactly.
And like you said at the start, Haiti is always portrayed as this country to the wider world. Like even me, the first experience I had of knowing Haiti existed was through natural disaster, right? And it's a shame for that to be a static image of Haiti for people, because unless you look back at the history of it, you don't see, the amount of things that was achieved through that resistance, through that movement.
This is exactly it. And because of this, when you look at resistance, because I do think you learn a lot about particular principles that we might want to anchor our work in through some of these fighters. And I think it's important that people understand these were not merely soldiers, not that this could be like merely, but enslaved people moving off instinct against a depraved condition of enslavement. These are people who had ideas, theories, philosophies that many of them wrote about, that many of them sung about, that many of them discussed in ceremony, that are accessible to us as tools and frameworks. Jacques Romain, interestingly enough, he is the founder of Haiti's Communist Party. He is who inspired Frantz Fanon to name his book Wretched of the Earth. It came from a poem that Jacques Romain wrote. And he discussed how through understanding Vodou, he was able to understand the material conditions of the people that he wanted to organize for. So even as the Vatican was leading anti-superstition campaigns, he was racing to catalog and build museums dedicated to these ceremonies, these practices, these philosophies, because he understood them, right, as a core way of understanding the hopes and dreams and aspirations of a people.
And some of the other clinical work that you do, would you call it clinical? I'll let you name it. But you kind of co-created these healing circles, right? Let me know if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Sawubona?
Solid.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Is that a Zulu word?
Yes.
Okay. How come you went with a Zulu word rather than Creole?
Boom. So I got you the whole thing. So the Sawubona healing circles in particular were developed during I was the student circle chair for the Association of Black Psychologists. So I was still finishing my studies. And at the time, right, COVID is rampant, right? Starts in New York. That's where I'm completing my training. Right. And I had some experience doing first response with COVID's hotline. So talking to people as people are losing family members left and right. They're isolated. And so in that role, the president of the Association of Black Psychologists, Theopia Jackson, pulled me into a team of clinicians to build an immediate first response for Black people who are experiencing disproportionate death on the front lines and at home due to COVID-19. And so Theopia Jackson, she offered the word Sawubona because she wanted to leverage that legacy, that idea, that philosophy of collective sight, of collective recognition as a power, as an engine for how we want to move through this circle work. Right. So the Sawubona Healing Circle became this way of connecting people virtually who are experiencing across the country, transnationally, their disconnection from their standard support networks. And how can we help y'all see one another through the experiences of disease, pandemic, but also at that time, right, police brutality, protest, economic, structural insecurity. How can y'all discuss this, right, without having to, again, you don't have the space in work, right? Maybe you might not have the space at home because your community has been fractured. So you can come to this space and be seen, right? And see yourself currently and also historically. We were sure that the Sawubona Healing Circles always leverage these types of traditions that we're talking about, the distinct African diasporic traditions. So whether that be in song, music, proverb, or concept to understand distress.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So practically, how would it look? Is it people of kind of different cultures and backgrounds coming together within the African diaspora, or how do you run the circles?
That's it. So and there's two, because I do too much, right? So there's two.
Tell me about it.
So the Sawubona Healing Circles are a type of crisis response. And so we maintain them virtually. And so as people were experiencing distress, we tried to make sure that at any given time, you could log into our circle and be met with two co-facilitators at least. Right. And so the co-facilitators would take people through an understanding of the concepts, because part of what we want to do is help people, even if that's not their immediate distress, begin to undo some of the colonial, historic, and racial oppression that people have experienced over centuries, right? So teaching people the value of Sawubona as a philosophical concept, teaching people about Zolo, a Kikango construct, an understanding of love that is activating and healing, teaching people about some of these scholars that we use to organize the circles very briefly as you're welcoming people to the space. And then you're helping people engage in whatever particular tradition or grounding practice that they might feel comfortable with. So a lot of them, for instance, use libation. Libation as a way of honoring everybody's ancestors, their family, the ancestors they know, the ones that they might not, the ones that they look up to, as a way of initially beginning to know one another. You can learn a lot about people through this kind of collective expression of who are you bringing with you to the space today. Right? Is it your father that you lost? Is it your son that you're thinking about? Is it Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X, Assata Shakur? Like, who are the people that are currently anchoring your dreams, your aspirations, your fire as you move into the healing process? And then the piece that's distinct from a therapy, a group therapy, is it's really then led by the people who are there. You allow people the complete open space to discuss whatever is on their hearts and minds. That's the main piece. We don't want to overeducate. We don't want the space to be pedantic. It's a space to let people discuss these aspects of their life that often become hidden.
Right. And I guess my question, and this is more, I think, my personal bugbear, is that
bugbear.
I
like that.
Do you guys have that word here? I don't know.
Maybe.
It's like a pet peeve, right?
Sure.
And it's a fact that I feel like the word healing and words like wellness
I love this question.
have been so commodified and so, become such a superficial way of describing health promotion, essentially, and some kind of intervention, that it almost, as soon as I see it attached to something, it makes me think, what is that? Is that someone trying to sell me a course? Is that someone trying to tell me to go on a really expensive trip to make myself feel better? Did you have that kind of barrier when you were first setting this up, or was it something that was so needed that actually people just, came to it regardless of, and there wasn't really that thought behind it?
So it's a powerful question. I would say there's two pieces to this. So the Sawubona healing circles are rooted in the tradition and practices of African-centered and Black psychology. I would say within that, you have a lot of different political paradigms, a lot of different goals that are seen as, to your point, like healing. They might be very disparate. When you look at Elena James Myers, for instance, she's a very powerful writer. She's what we call a Jegna for me in the Association of Black Psychologists.
A Jegna, what's that?
We call it Jegna. So we don't like using the word mentorship. So we look at these ideas of the people who help you become a scholar, warrior, inheriting all the responsibilities that come with that, right? Okay. As opposed to maybe the professionalization of mentorship.
I see.
So it's seen as being a little bit more comprehensive. Again, a lot of people are very intentional about naming also. What does that carry? Yeah. What is the responsibility that comes with particular words and particular names? So Elena James Myers has optimal conceptual theory. And so within that, her idea of, as you would name it, healing, wellness, come from the optimal versus the suboptimal worldview. To arrive at these, she studied a lot of African indigenous cultures. She anchored particularly in the Egyptian mystery systems, the Kemetic ways of knowing, and saw ideas of collectivity, of harmony between human and nature, kind of moving past the distinction between human and nature. Okay. Right? Understand the self as essentially collective. These being the core pieces that early peoples valued, and thus anchoring our ideas of where we want to be. Right? How do we want to think? She contrasts this with what she calls the suboptimal worldview, which is those ideas that are rooted more in, we might see, to say this broadly, like a European conceptual system. Okay. So ideas of materialism, dominance, individualism, distinction between man and nature. And so her understanding is a lot of the distress that we see as manifest in distinct mental health problems can be rooted in these kind of frictions between people's values and their beliefs. What does it mean, again, to want to be well, but to live in a context that is too expensive for you to have your basic needs, where you understand yourself as somebody who wants to be a provider, and you're in a structural condition in which you're consistently robbed of the resources to do so. Yeah. Right? So making those pieces very clear. So the Sawubona healing circles, circling all the way back, roots in a lot in that tradition. Yeah. So and through some of the concepts that we anchor people in as we begin, we allow them to kind of flow through those and see how they move towards particular values. We have done a little bit of research on them. Yeah. We have a paper, hopefully by the time this comes out, the paper will be out. But looking at what are the impacts of people who have longer experience with the healing circles. They come, they speak to people transnationally around the world, Black people who have these experiences. And we see these increases in collective identity, increases in Pan-African kinship, these ideas of validation, right, kind of puncturing through what's often historical and political gaslighting for people who have, again, their resources stripped, their cultures, their names, their skin demeaned, to be in a place that sees the fullness of who they are and what they're experiencing and persevering through nonetheless simply feels good for a lot of people.
Yeah. And you've actually touched on my next question a little bit, because my question always is, we do all of these things in this kind of, it almost feels like a vacuum when people are in that space, and then they leave back to the same world, the same struggles. Yeah. And one thing that I thought of as you were telling me about the fact that you guys set it up during the COVID pandemic was during the COVID pandemic in England, I was working in one of the busiest hospitals in London, and we all got redeployed to the most needed units. So I was in an intensive care unit. I already knew I was going to be a psychiatrist, so I was stressed about having to do central lines and learning all these new procedures that I'd never have to use again. But I was there for 5 months, and they had, very nicely had a, free wellbeing practitioner that was available to go to anytime. Didn't access it once. Sure. Didn't go there once, because I think in my head, it's almost like the Maslow's hierarchy. I was in survival mode. Yeah. I was not thinking about how helpful it might be to talk to someone about, the stress. And it probably would have been helpful. It probably would have been really helpful. But what I did was I just go back home and call my mum. Call my dad. So I think it's interesting that you're doing this work conscious of that space that you're working in, but also bringing that in to your circles and acknowledging the reality of it?
Yeah. So I want to name two. The one piece is part of why I like circle work is it also penetrates through that barrier between the practitioner and the attendee. Right? So to your point, like you're doing so much of this work. You're there as a provider, trying to help people through some of the worst experiences that they'll ever have in their life. And you feel commitment to that. And so because of that, you have to remove yourself. That's what the profession would say. In circle, you bring your full self to it. And so I'd been to circles where I open, I lead the libation, and I get nourished by the people who come. I learn tremendously from the attendees who are helping me navigate because I'm also there in circle with them. So I'm also sharing where I'm at. And so as you pour out, as you hold space for others, they do the same for you. And so it ends up being one of the most nourishing types of practices that I have engaged in. The piece I also want to name is distinct, right? And so Black psychology, people might not be familiar with Black studies as a tradition globally, but concerned itself not necessarily with the transformation of a discipline. It concerned itself with the transformation and the liberation of a people. Right? So Frantz Fanon is in this legacy. I mentioned Amos Wilson is in this legacy. Because of this, it's not often not sufficient. This goes back to your point around the commodification of healing and wellness. It's not solely that we want people to feel stress-free, feel comfortable within a oppressive context. We want people to also gain the consciousness and the political tools necessary to materially shift themselves, right? Collectively. And so a lot of the healing circles are specifically designed around what are the particular healing, but understanding healing as also a political process. What are these needs that are necessary? So the La Kutanama circles, which are the ones that we have in Haiti, for instance, each of those also has a griot, which the Salbona healing circles don't have.
That's like the kind of the storyteller, right?
Boom. This is it, right? And so the griot captures the story of the circle, right? We discuss what are your pains. We have people who are experiencing displacement due to the revocation of TPS, or up to this point, the threat of the revocation of TPS, displacement due to paramilitary violence on the island. And we hear from them about these experiences. What is it like to be thrown into diaspora, to be disconnected from your family, to nonetheless also be afraid of your own beliefs and your own history? And then we ask people, what would you do if you could do anything for your people? And we catalog and archive that, right, as political commitments. Because a lot of people like to speak for Haitian people. They like to speak for Black people, the people who are the most marginalized, the most invisibilized. And in these circles, we want to make sure, like, no, in people's despair, they also still dream. Let's hold ourselves to the dreams of the people as opposed to imagining ones that might make us more comfortable. And so there's this political mission as well.
And that brings me on to because you mentioned about Louis Mars, and he very much functioned as a psychiatrist within a dictatorship. What do you make of that? Because he had to work alongside that regime to do the work that he did, which I guess some people might critique and might say that, you know, are you really working against oppression if you had to use it to achieve what you did?
It's a fantastic question, and I've talked to his son about that. I've talked to his son about those contradictions, what that was like. What his son named was, at the time, that was the regime. If you wanted to work for the state, if you want to better state practices, at a time when it should be noted, right, there's a lot of political will globally to undermine the existence of a Black nation. And so if you want to better things structurally, how can I do so in a way that allows me to affect the most possible change? And so for Louis Mars, this came from a consistent advocacy against the Duvalier regime when it came to what are the structural conditions for people who are living with mental illness in Haiti. He had a tremendous amount of power, which I also want to name too when we're thinking about what do the decisions that we make, the strategic decisions that we make, consider, again, what's the power that we have to shift particular practices. So at the time, Louis Mars was rewriting the code, rewriting the facilities, rewriting the training of the entire field in the context of Haiti. Right. So when people are also curious about, do I want to work or reform a particular system, do a power analysis also.
Yeah.
Right. And so he's refining and reshaping and building the entire structure itself. He's building models of care that are communal, that are outpatient based, as opposed to the asylum based care that that Europe at the time was trying to promote as the ideal type of technology. He welcomed social workers, teachers, Vodou practitioners into a community of care for people who are experiencing deep pain, which is a revolutionary way of engaging in healing for the types of people that we're talking about who require community to fully see them. He was training an entire cohort of Haitian psychiatrists within this model. And I want to name, he was doing all this prior to Frantz Fanon's initial writings. So to the time when you get some of the American writers coming there, they're astounded by the network that exists. What shifts, this is to your point about better understanding this power analysis, Duvalier also allows Nathan Klein, who's a New York psychiatrist, to have just as much a say in the development of Haiti's psychiatric paradigm. And so what you get is, and I talk with an archivist who's doing some of this work, you get a lot of American pharmaceutical companies who become highly invested in moving away from Haiti's model of outpatient care towards a model of, again, asylum, wanting to prove that because they don't have as many restrictions, we can use our pharmaceutical drugs to be the sole intervention in the cure of psychological disorder and psychological disease. So you see the slow removal of this kind of community care towards the asylum-based system that they had so desperately tried to remove. To the piece, Louis Mars, because Duvalier, this is according to Louis Mars' son, Duvalier feared Louis Mars's run for presidency, becoming the leader. He gets appointed as ambassador and sent away from the country. And so a lot of his work then ends up being off the island itself, where Nathan Klein is allowed to design the entire infrastructure. And what we see now is the legacy of Nathan Klein, that asylum, kind of individualized and it's I would say it's torturous for people in some of these spaces now, and it's a shame that that's what's become of it.
Gosh, the things that have been done in history and things we still have to do.
Yeah,
I have a million more questions, but we have to wrap up.
Yes.
Today. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been so fascinating to listen to you speak. I could just listen to you speak all day, but it's fine. We'll end it there. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Culture Gap. Our guest episodes drop on the last Sunday of every month. If this conversation made you think differently about mental health, there's a lot more coming. Follow us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and find us on social media to connect, one story at a time.